Welcome to the Work in Progress podcast. This is a space where we want to create conversations around things that actually matter. Thanks for joining us today. We hope these words encourage you to know that no matter where we are in our journeys, we're all still a work in progress. Hey, what's up? Welcome back to the Work in Progress podcast. The Work in Progress podcast. Don't forget that name ever.
Hello, all of our neighbor friends.
Yeah, that's good, man.
Our family,
That's
our Work
good.
in Progress.
I see what
neighbors.
you're doing there. Hey, dude, I'm always coming to you with a need for help, man, because I feel like
Because you need a lot of help.
You're the wisest guy I know. My fingers are
You
crossed.
must not know a lot of people.
I don't. I really don't. But dude, I need some help. I need some advice. We're in the process of moving, as you know. By the time this is released, we'll probably already be moved in. But that's even better timing because we're trying to figure out like how to, get in contact with the people that we're going to live by, our neighbors, physically, literal neighbors, right? And I remember a couple episodes ago, you talked about, you can bake them cookies or do something like that. But
bake them cookies.
I'm not a baking kind of guy. I'm not a cookie kind of guy. I try to stay on the health train. And I want to reciprocate that. I want to make sure everybody else is healthy too. Not that there's anything wrong with cookies. That's just not my thing. So dude, like, what do I do if I don't know how to bake cookies? And, I'm trying to make sure my neighbors live till they're 120.
Wow.
Because I just want them to be healthy, dude. What do I do, man? How do I get to know them? How do I be a good neighbor?
Man, two things before we even start. Number one, why are you moving in the hottest time of the year? That's the first thing. It's probably like 109 degrees outside right now, and you're going to be moving. So.
Yeah, because I don't want to have to drive an hour to come film this podcast every week, dude. How about that?
You could have moved in December.
Meet me halfway.
All right, so that's the first thing. Second thing, I might have had a piece of cookie for breakfast. Cookies are great. Someone delivered crumble cookies to our house, and they've just been sitting on the counter, and I'm like, get those out of here. They're so good. Crumble cookies
is good,
they're
man.
so good. Okay, so how do you be a good neighbor? I think if you're not going to do the cookie route, it might be a little awkward, but that's okay. So literally go like you're in a house, right? So just like spend some time outside. Backyard, front yard. Fun fact, before we lived in an apartment, we had a house and we would hang out in our backyard a lot. And because we had two dogs. And so we just would hang out back there. Mm-hmm. And our neighbor behind us was also always outside. And he was a little more awkward than I am. And he would find always something to talk about. Every time I'm outside, this man would talk to us. And so that's what you have to be. You have to be that neighbor that just finds a way to talk to them. So it's going to be awkward. It's going to be weird. But the goal would be to have a conversation, to begin that hopefully friendship. And so how you do that, like practically, I think you begin to pray now, even before you move in, for your neighbors. That way you put like opportunities to connect with them.
Yeah.
And then I think a super practical thing is try your best, and I'm terrible at this, but try your best to remember their name.
That's a tough one.
Instead of being like, hey man, hey bro,
Hey
like,
brother.
hey John, hey Sam, hey whoever, whatever their name is.
Yeah.
Because that shows them that you're trying to be intentional. Mm-hmm. And so again, like I'm not good at this. I'm terrible at memorizing names. I'm good with faces, not good with names. But I think that's where you start if you're not going to bake cookies, even though everybody will like you more if you bring them cookies.
That might be true. I'm going to go over with a bag of broccoli. Hey, John.
Ew, gross.
Hey, John.
I wouldn't open the door. So the whole idea with us, if you didn't hop on a couple podcasts ago about being a neighbor, was if we want to evangelize, basically, if we want to share the gospel with people around us, the way you can start doing that is by being a good neighbor. And so today we thought we'd talk about like, what does it actually mean to be a good neighbor? Why do we be a neighbor? Who is my neighbor? Those are all these questions about neighboring. And so most often, if you are in this season of life, being fresh out of school, 20s, early 30s, you probably find yourself in our area living in an apartment because rental houses can be crazy expensive. And so even more so, like, okay, who is my neighbor? How do I neighbor well? And so, that's kind of where our conversation is going to head at today. And so I want to start off the conversation about being a good neighbor with a couple of things. Number one, if everyone were 100% honest, they would tell you that they are all desperate for a relationship. Even the people who are like, I'm not a people person, If they were honest, 100% of people long for deep, meaningful relationships. That's just how we're wired as human beings. Like, we're not made to live alone. We're made for relationships. And so, number one, we're all in that boat. And so when you hear this idea of being a good neighbor, being a good friend, know that deep, deep down, no matter how many scars or things that people carry with them, there is a need to be loved. And so with that idea, I think we have to ask the question of who is my neighbor. And I don't know how familiar you are with Luke chapter 10 in scripture. You know the story of the Good Samaritan?
Very, very familiar.
Okay, so Jesus is speaking and somebody asked this exact question: who is my neighbor? And so if you haven't checked out this story, you really should. Luke 10. Maybe we'll link, shout out to YouVersion. Maybe we'll link Luke 10 in our show notes so you can go read it. Super, super well-known story about the Good Samaritan. But we're going to focus just on this idea of neighboring today. Yeah. And so when you read this story, you read this passage, you have the question of who is my neighbor? And when I hear the story of the Good Samaritan, I actually really, really like this idea of neighbor. Because just like you moving into a new house, you don't get to choose who your neighbors are. Mm. Your neighbors are there. Or if they move in after you, they move in and they don't get to choose you. Right? You don't get to choose who your neighbors are. And I think Jesus is using this term here because he realizes you don't choose your neighbors. They're just there. And so when you ask yourself that question of who's my neighbor, the answer is it's who's there in your path, your circle, in your neighborhood, in your workspace, in your school space, wherever. It's who's there. So how are you going to answer back your own question? How are you going to be a good neighbor to start when you move in? Give me some practicals.
Oh, dude, you know what?
Beyond the cookies.
I think when we move in, I'll probably go knock on the door and say, hey, my name's Aaron. We are moving in right here. And sorry if anything's loud. Just wanted to say hi and introduce myself.
Great.
I think that's the best like icebreaker, right? Because it is going to be loud. All that's true. That gives you a reason to, well, you don't have to be in the house because you're moving things back and forth from the truck to the house. And so,
and you know, people are always nosy too.
True.
Whenever you move in a neighborhood, people are like peeking and like, oh.
Yeah.
And they're going to see that Taylor's pregnant and they're going to be like, oh no, the crying. And then you just like lean into that of like, hey, sorry, we're having a baby. It might be a little loud, but they're going to be cute. And so you can do that. And it's really fun. Yeah, I think
that's good.
Being a neighbor is tough, right? Because you don't, especially like if we're talking about like our literal neighbors, people that live in our neighborhood, everybody goes through stuff in life. Like, right, you may have a really bad day at work, or you may have a really bad day in your marriage, or you may be tired, or especially when the baby comes, you will be tired. And that's always the moment when somebody just like comes knock at your door. It's your neighbor trying to knock at your door. And so it's really hard to be a good neighbor because it seems like they always show up at the least expectant times.
Right.
So super, super practical there to start. I want to ask you an example of some time or some relationship or some instance that you've had where maybe not necessarily the person next door, but somebody that was in your life as a neighbor that God put in your path, and just kind of tell me like maybe it was a rocky relationship or how it started, maybe how you saw God move, or just kind of share with like the listening audience, like what did that look like to be a good neighbor when it wasn't somebody living right next door to you? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Geez, man, so you want me to say it from when somebody wasn't directly like actually physically next door?
I mean, they could be, but just give like somebody maybe a practical story behind like, what does it look like to be a neighbor? Or what does that mean? Like, how do I share the love of Jesus with somebody where they live next door to me? Or maybe it's just like a really close person like that sat next to me in school or something, you know?
Yeah. So, growing up, my dad he was not the perfect example. I don't think anybody's a perfect example except for Jesus, but my dad was a very good example of this, right? Because everybody knows, like, you know, growing up, whether it be in your small town or your school or somebody you work with, a coworker or whatever, there's always that person who's maybe a little awkward or socially awkward, or maybe, quote, for lack of a better terms, like kind of weird. And my dad modeled that so well, man, like going to people who were maybe the outcasts of the group and bringing them in and literally inviting them over for dinner. He modeled that so well for us over time. People who may even have like mental challenges or mental disabilities, like very clearly, he's like, hey, I want to like treat you at a nice dinner. He would go take them out, or he would literally invite them in the house, and my mom and him would cook a dinner for them, and we'd all hang out and enjoy that. And so I think that has definitely rubbed off on me, and I've seen my dad model that. And like, you know, he works with this guy, and man, like my dad does like handyman work, and so this guy that he's been working with for a while is similar in that category I was just describing. And they were on a job. My dad had a trailer hitch attached to his truck and a trailer on the hitch. And he was like, hey man, is everything ready to go? Cause we're done with this. We got to go home. He's like, yep, everything's good to go. And so they take off, they get home. And when they get to the house, my dad realizes that the guy never put the tailgate back up on his truck. Oof. And so that whole time, 20-minute drive, the tailgate was hitting the trailer hitch of my dad's truck, his new truck, right? Scratched it all up. It was like terrible condition. And like, that was, my dad gets mad pretty fast. Got mad, swallowed his pride, was like, you know what? It's okay, dude. And like, that didn't deter him from inviting the guy back out to work. It didn't deter him from like being a good neighbor and saying, you know what? It's okay. Everybody makes mistakes, you know? And I think the ultimate example in my life is my dad, my real dad. And he does that so well. And so I was able to model that in college. Whenever there were people who may not have had the most friends, I always made sure to like invite them along and be like, dude, you're more than welcome to come and hang out and enjoy this hangout we're about to have. You know, this going bowling, you want to come, or come over to the house. We're just chilling. You just chill with us. There's no worries if you can't make it, but we'd love to have you there. And I think, for lack of a better example, that's not the greatest example because it's not specific, but my dad honestly just modeled that so well growing up. And those people never lived anywhere near us. Like my dad was always like physically picking them up from like their house, which could have been 30 minutes away. Yeah, man, I think that's a really good example of this. And he does that still to this day. And there's a guy that he knew in high school that still calls him like once every couple months, and they'll just have a conversation on the phone. Yeah. He hasn't seen this guy in 30 years, but yet he still makes time to talk to him, and like neighbors to him without even being in the proximity of like same town. So pretty that's cool, good. Man.
That's good. Yeah, that's just interesting. Let's go one more step into this. All right. So we're talking about like our neighbor not being the one that's right next door. But our neighbor is actually the one that God puts in your path right here, right now. Matter of fact, if I like stopped you and said, hey, that person in your head that you have a hard time avoiding, even though you try to avoid, or maybe that person that God just keeps putting in your path constantly, we probably have somebody that comes to our mind. And so no matter how different they are, no matter how inconvenienced you might feel by them being keep crossing your path, no matter how unexpected it might be, we've been tasked with loving them. Like that's the neighbor. And so honestly, like if I could share, about like my life, I think I did a really good job of being a good neighbor, air quote neighbor, to people that were in my church already. Mm-hmm. Like it was super easy for me to like be a great neighbor to somebody that I went to church with. Oh, they need something? Cool. I got it. Oh, you need, to borrow a car or need a ride? Great. You need a tool or something? Great. I got it. Mm-hmm. Dinner? Cool. Come over. We got you. But I always struggled early on in my like legit, like spiritual life, adulthood, of loving like the least of these. Right. Yeah. And so when I read the story of the Good Samaritan, this parable from Jesus, that the Good Samaritan is the hero in this story, although he is the least of these in the mind of who he's talking to, right? Because he's willing to cross all the lines, like racial, political, cultural, everything. Like he risked it all. He didn't care what people were going to say about him and how they were going to look at him, because he saw need in his neighbor and he met that need. And so I think that's my big takeaway when you have this conversation about neighboring, because you can't choose them. And so oftentimes I'll put myself in that boat. Like we put ourselves in this, like, yeah, I'm doing a good job being a neighbor because I'm helping the people who are just like me good people that, need something, like, yeah, I'm going to help them. But of course, God didn't like let me stay in that like comfortable state. So like almost 4 years ago now, we left our house and did some apartment ministry. And honestly, there was like people that I knew like it was going to be easy to love. And like, yeah, like this is going to be, yeah, great. We're just throwing events, we're having a good time. But I didn't realize like how much I was going to change by who God put into our lives, like through those times. And so of course, like literally our first event, like a couple of groups of people walk in and I'm already like uneasy. And like, I'm in the back of my mind, I'm like, I know I'm supposed to go and love these people, even though they don't believe like I do. They don't look like I do. They don't act like I do. I'm still called to go and love these people. And so like, it's still a work in progress. Like I'm still, of course, everybody brings their like biases to the table, and you have to work to break that down. But I think when we get this idea of who's your neighbor and like loving the least of these, it's exactly that. Like your neighbor is not the person who you would think like, this is so easy to go and grab a meal with them. Like, no, it's the person that you're like, I don't know if I could stand in a room 5 minutes with them because they're that annoying. I think those are the people that God puts in your path to be loved, to be loved by you. And so
I agree, man.
It's littered all over scripture, right? Like it's everywhere. Like the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul. And the second is like it.
Yeah.
Love your neighbor as yourself.
That's good, man.
And so
that makes me think like, I think to your point, it is very easy to love the people you already know, right? It's very easy to love your friends in your community at church or your work community, right? And the people that you spend time with, it's easier to give them more of that time, right? Because you already know it's almost like you already know exactly how it's going to play out. So
you're comfortable.
It's exactly right. And I think you said it a good word, right? Like it's convenience. And when you are when you feel like that urge to go neighbor to somebody who's not quote unquote convenient to hang out with. I think that, there's gonna be some selfish strings that are pulled there. Right. But I think that reminds me of John 13:34. And I'm not quoting this by memory. I am reading it cause I just had to be clear there. It says, a new command I give you, love one another as I have loved you. You must love one another. Right. And I think that goes well with the neighboring. Because Jesus is saying literally like, as I have loved you, you must go love one another. And I love how Jesus is like vaguely specific, right? It's specific by saying you must love one another, but it's vague because he's not putting any adjectives in front of that, right? He's not saying you must love the people in your church. You must not, you must love the people that you grew up with or your friends currently, right? It's like you must love one another. So there's like a vagueness to that that doesn't discriminate against anybody. And I think to your point, man, like Christians are the ones that usually get that messed up most of the time, right? Where we add the adjectives. Oh, I'm going to love them because they're already in my church and they believe the same. Or if it's a political thing or if it's a racial thing. And I think it's important to know that like, Jesus didn't say anything about that, right? Like he just says, love one another. And I think that's a really good example of neighboring, right? A really good.
Yeah. So since you quoted John 13, it's like, as I have loved you, which remember, Jesus died for those who hated him. And so like, that's the standard that he's been given to you. That's the standard. And when he says, go love your neighbor, that's just like I did. Like that's his action. So I think, as we wrap up, I want to leave practical pieces. And so I had 3 things written down. How do I actually go and be a good neighbor? How do I do it? Number 1, I think you have to be available. So like example, like, right. Like if you're moving into a neighborhood, it's not filling up your schedule or always being inside your house or never like coming out and talking to people. It's like, be available. You can't actually be a good neighbor if you don't actually know who they are. So number 1, be available. Number 2, be compassionate. I think so often, like I say, like we can bring our biases into these things and we just assume people stories by looking at them. And so being compassionate, hearing their story, trying to figure out where they're coming from. Even the guy who's got this super loud like motorcycle that cranks out like at 3:00 in the morning when my baby's asleep, man. Like
I've seen that guy at your house, bro.
I have to be compassionate. Maybe that's the only vehicle he could afford that he's got to get to work. I don't know. But instead of being so frustrated by it, like maybe I should have a little bit of compassion. So be available, be compassionate. And then like meet them where they are. You're probably not going to agree with every single one of your neighbors, whether, all across all spectrums. But before you're quick to assume and jump on, like putting them in certain categories, just meet them where they are. Get to know them. Pray that God would give you the eyes to see them as He sees them, as a human being, as a child of God. And so, just as we wrap up, like I just want you to remember, like you can't choose your neighbors, but you can choose how do you live life with them.
Yeah.
Like you can't choose your neighbors, but you can choose how you love them. You can't choose your neighbors, but you can choose how you interact with them. And so I think reading through Luke chapter 10, I think it's a very clear reminder that we are called to go and be good neighbors. Yep. How else are you going to be able to share the gospel if you never actually meet your neighbors? And so
absolutely.
Do that. Maybe, just maybe, you might break down some walls and have some really good conversations, and you may just have God change your neighborhood, and that would be awesome. Okay, so little conversation about being a good neighbor, and we're coming up on time. And so what I want to do is wrap up today with creators. Now, you can't take the same route you took last week, naming yourself. Dude, not allowed anymore.
It's worthy of 2 weeks.
So, no, it is not. So, who's your creator this week?
AV
not
Media.
Named Aaron.
All right. This guy's name is
Aaron.
Ulysses.
His name was Aaron.
This guy's last name is Villa. This guy's name is Ulysses Gabriel. He's a creative video media producer at BPN, actually.
The BPN boys.
BPN boys, dude. This guy, I'm pretty sure he was recently baptized, and he's been putting in a lot of work with his soul work.
Come on.
And so it's cool to see, man. There's a picture of the baptism, which was in May, right? So congratulations to him, and he's got great work. So we'll tag him in the show notes.
Nice. My creator this week is so I had 3 different people send me the same reel 2 weeks ago on Instagram. And so I was at camp and I didn't really get to check it out, but I checked it out here last week. And it's this DJ. His name is I Hear Canvas. I think is his tag. I Hear Canvas on Instagram. And this guy mixes gospel tracks, some old ones, some new ones, just traditional gospel. And he mixes it with R&B beats. And it's maybe my favorite thing ever. You hear this Mariah Carey beat and it's got some gospel track over it.
That's awesome.
Dude, it's dope. I was literally listening to this Usher beat and it was gospel over it. It was awesome. I loved it. Basically his whole real thing is if the DJ got saved last night or something. I don't know. It's funny. It's cool.
That's good.
But he's actually, it's really creative. Go check him out. You have a good little laugh. Enjoy some sweet beats and some dope tracks. So check those out. We'll tag them in the show notes. Yeah, man.
Follow our Instagram because we got some events going on if you're local to the area.
That's right. And we want to know what you guys want to talk about. We'll put some polls out there here in the near future of maybe some topics you guys want to discuss.
Yeah, absolutely.
But until then, you have one job, and it's to go be a good neighbor.
Bring them broccoli sprouts.
Don't bring broccoli. Bring them cookies. Don't bring them broccoli.
I don't even eat broccoli, bro. That's too far.
It's nasty.
Anyways, all right. See you later.
See ya. Peace.